lectures here in History Through Film. Today, as we continue our unit on warfare, we're really going to kind of bring things to the modern era with modern warfare. We're really going to look at really some complex ideas because modern warfare is more than just gunpowder. So we've got two learning targets that we're going to attempt to answer through today's lecture. The first one is pretty straightforward. It says summarize the warfare techniques and strategies used in the modern world. The second question says compare and contrast ancient, medieval, and modern warfare based on Sun Tzu's principles. So we really want to try to be able to do a comparison to see if Sun Tzu applies to all of these eras or what's changed based on Sun Tzu's principles. You see down in the left-hand corner, we see the same little warning that you've seen in the past two lectures. It says this lecture information will need to be included on your unit assessment. So just make sure you're taking good notes so you have everything you need here today. So what are we going to learn? What's our path to learning here? We're going to first have to start with gunpowder. Gunpowder is definitely a game changer, so we'll talk a little bit about that. We'll talk about new weapons in the modern warfare era, and that's changed a lot even since the beginning of gunpowder. But then we're going to really look at 4 different eras of modern warfare. First generation, second generation, third generation, and fourth generation. You're going to kind of see how this breaks down and really what the experts say about modern warfare. So this is where we're going with all of this.
Now, one thing you should understand is we do go through this because you're able to watch this on your own screen, on a Chromebook in front of you, or on your computer at home, or your tablet or phone. It is imperative that you understand that you can pause and write things down. So I'm going to go somewhat quickly with this, a little bit faster than I would if I was lecturing to you in person, because I know that you can stop and write these things. Normally I would stop and give you an opportunity to do that, but you have that power at your fingertips. So gunpowder developed, and like I said, it's a game changer. So the development of gunpowder and subsequent weapons greatly altered the landscape of battle. As you can imagine, it makes warfare far less personal. I can stand across a room or across a field and fire a weapon and maybe kill one or multiple people just by pulling a trigger. This led to the development of sophisticated forms of combat, many of which we're going to talk about here. Artillery, dropping bombs, certain different guns, all sorts of different things that we're going to look at. It was revolutionized by the Europeans due to constant conflict, but it doesn't come to us from Europe. As this image over here suggests, it actually comes from China and will ultimately spread to Europe. And the Europeans, because of the nature of their culture, really took this and ran with it and made a lot of different weapons using gunpowder. So new weapons and defense. Well, you've got breech-loaded rifles, which you can see here, sitting here and firing there. Artillery cannons. Artillery cannons are going to be really, really important, and they're going to advance even later on as we reach the first, second, and third stages or generations of warfare. But the big reason artillery cannons were so important, or cannons in general, is because they could penetrate the walls that were seen as unpenetrable before. So there's a great quote here by Niccolo Machiavelli, who some of you may be familiar of. He was a Renaissance writer who wrote a famous book called The Prince. He says there's no wall whatsoever, or whatever its thickness, that artillery will not destroy in only a few days. Once you have cannons, that's very, very true. To build walls to withstand that is virtually impossible. With stone and even steel, artillery cannons will eventually break through. So to combat this, you started altering the size of your walls. You started building star fort designs, which you see here, which meant in order to break through, an enemy would have to break through multiple layers or multiple walls to get into a city, which would use a lot of resources and thus make it difficult to actually use artillery to get into a city. One of the things that also became a real big deal, and you kind of also see that from this image here, is the Maxim machine gun. The Maxim machine gun is a huge game changer. Basically, it allows the person shooting to have the ability to shoot multiple rounds a minute, more than multiple rounds. And because they were able to basically come up with a system where the gas that is expelled from a cartridge that when it's shot is used to help load the next cartridge in place, and it can do that almost instantaneously. Certainly these had a tendency to overheat, but now you could actually fire dozens of rounds a minute, and that really makes fighting on the battlefield that much more treacherous. Now, a variety of sources describe the beginning of modern warfare at different times in history. There's no one agreed upon time period. According to some military experts, there are 3 generations of war and possibly a 4th. And we're going to look at those today. And that's going to help us understand modern warfare a little bit more deeply. According to some of these sources, the first generation of modern warfare started with the Peace of Westphalia in 1684. This ended the 30 Years' War, which was the bloodiest conflict in Europe at the time. The German male population in this war decreased by 50%. And I'll talk a little bit more about this on the next slide. Here's an image of the signing of the Treaty of Westphalia. But the Treaty of Westphalia, what's really important about talking about it is not so much what it was about, it's more what it created. So I want to talk about that here. So if we look here at the creation of the first generation of modern warfare, the Treaty of Westphalia created independent states or nation states who gained the monopoly on war. What does that mean? Well, you have to look at this next line. Because wars were once fought between families. Different wars, it might be the Lancasters versus the Yorks. Different tribes fought each other. Different religions fought each other, like in the Crusades or the 30 Years' War. Sometimes different cities fought each other, and sometimes even businesses fought each other. That was warfare prior to the introduction of gunpowder and prior to the Treaty of Westphalia. But what happens here is now you start seeing warfare between state militias. My country versus your country, or my boundary versus your boundary. And that is significantly different than what I just described here in this line. And with that, you get the idea of we're going to war against your country. Before it was seen as fights or skirmishes, but this is going to be full-on war of my political system versus your political system. And of course, this is going to lead to the growth of nationalism. Nationalism's a big deal because nationalism is our identity. In each country in the modern world has some form of nationalism. So nationalism is a sense of national consciousness, exalting one nation above all others and placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interest, as opposed to those of other nations or supranational groups. What do I really mean by that? What does that definition really boil down to? It's that I feel my country is better than your country. And with that sort of attitude, it's very easy to understand why small events, whether it's the killing of one person or taking of resources or whatnot, can lead to war. Because if I have extreme pride in my country, if I believe my country is better than your country, I'm going to do whatever I can to defend it. And so nationalism is really a big game changer. And that's why the Peace of Westphalia, which changed the game in Europe, really started to develop this national sense of identity for many different countries. A lot of this nationalism started shortly thereafter in the American and French Revolution. So within about 100 years, people started saying, hey, I'm American. I'm going to fight for my colonies and I'm going to drive out the British. Same as the French. They started identifying themselves as what they wanted to be. Some of them didn't want to be ruled by the Bourbon dynasty anymore, and they were willing to fight against that. And they felt strongly that we should protect France and its interests. So this led to the creation of massive armies, as you can imagine. If I want to protect my country, I've got to have a group or a force that's willing to do that. Here's a great quote by Sidney Harris. He says, the difference between patriotism and nationalism is that the patriot is proud of his country for what it does. And the nationalist is proud of his country no matter what it does. The first attitude creates a feeling of responsibility, but the second, a feeling of blind arrogance that leads to war. So you can be patriotic and you can believe in nationalism that my country's the best, but you also have to admit when that country is wrong. And if you are unable to do that and you are willing to defend your country at any cost, that can lead to some wars, and we've seen that in history. So the first generation of warfare, modern warfare continued. It really changed things in terms of how things are fought on the battlefield. So it's based on battlefield of order, which created a culture of order in the military. You have different ranks. Now, you still were led by gentlemen. You were still led by nobles and aristocrats who were seen as your officers. But you definitely start to see this, a ranking system, like a meritocracy, a modern army. So you have a separation of the combatant and non-combatant, different dress. Think something like this. You have your soldiers on the field and your officers often dressed differently than that. Certainly you get a change in the battles. You have different lines and column tactics. As I mentioned, you're led by aristocrats, people who are landowners, people who are wealthy. In the 1700s, this is what you would have seen. But warfare really became very suicidal with the invention of the machine gun. Think this. You have your machine gun, and you have all these guys running out in this open field, and this is what we would have seen in World War I. It's really kind of a dumb way to fight a war because you're not going to survive. You're going to have all these different machine guns shooting at you. Your chance of making it across that field is very, very little. So order started to break down, and this is going to lead to a change in warfare, which is going to be our second generation of warfare. I'm going to show you this clip in just a little bit. We don't have time to see it here on this clip. So we start seeing the development of industrial warfare. This starts within the first and second generations of warfare. Industrial warfare is mass production. You now have the means to produce a lot of goods. And this came from post-19th century. So from the post-19th century ended with the atomic age, which was the end of World War II. So this is when we really start to have factories pumping out a lot of different weapons, rifles, muskets, things like that. In 1935, this guy here, Eric Ludendorff, called for a total war, complete mobilization and subordination of all resources, including policy and social systems to the war effort. This means civilians back at home were fighting. This means all the soldiers would be brought in and believe in the same thing. This would mean all different facets, whether you had an Air Force or a Navy or an Army, all of them would work together in total war. And we hadn't really seen anything like that before, because in the modern world that hadn't existed yet really prior to the 20th century. So when we really see this happen for the first time, it happens during the American Civil War. There are several main reasons for the development of industrial warfare. World growth for industrial production, meaning more goods are being sold around the world. Mechanization created the need for greater infrastructure. We had more factories, we had more machines, and so naturally you're going to produce more of that. And you couldn't live off the land anymore. You had too big of armies. You needed supply lines, which means you needed eventually trucks and things like that would be used to bring goods to the battlefields. We also see the development in the developed use of propaganda, rationing, and conscription on the home front. And I'm going to talk about those in just a little bit. So I'm going to skip conscription right now because I'm running out of time on this clip. So bear with me here. And we're going to go ahead and end right there. I'm going to come back and I'm going to continue to talk about conscription.